Welcome to my guide for Budget AMD CPUs. Here we will explore the entry and the lower range AMD CPUs and APUs. Now AMD CPUs have come a long way in recent years, and I believe I would not be far off if I say that AMD currently holds the crown for having the better performance per dollar value compared to Intel CPUs. So with that said, whether you are building a PC for home use, a budget gaming PC, or a PC for a light workstation, I really think that the AMD budget segment would interest you. Now, before we look into the actual CPU choices, it is important that you understand how the budget segment for the AMD CPUs is divided. Basically, there are two types of AMD CPUs that you can find in the budget segment. The first are the CPUs that come with an integrated graphics card. AMD calls them accelerated processing units or APUs, and these have a G suffix in their name. So examples include processors like this, such as the AMD Ryzen 3 3200G, G being the key letter here, with Radeon Vega 8 graphics, and the AMD Athlon 3000G with its Vega 3 graphics. It is interesting to note here that unlike with the Intel CPUs, where almost every CPU comes with an integrated graphics card, in the case of AMD only a handful do, and these processors, as mentioned, are separated with their distinct G suffix in the end. An integrated graphics card is very important for certain budget builds, particularly due to the fact that if you want to use the video output ports of your motherboard, such as the HDMI, the DP, or the VGA port of your motherboard, then you need an integrated graphics card on your CPU. Motherboards do not have an onboard graphics processing unit to operate the video ports and to connect them to your monitor. Therefore, they rely on the CPU's integrated graphics card to support the video output ports. It must also be highlighted here briefly that the integrated graphics cards found on AMD APUs, such as the Vega series integrated cards, are better performing than the integrated graphics cards found on an average Intel CPU. We will explore the performance of the CPUs and the graphics processing later as we progress through the video. As far as the APUs are concerned, unfortunately most of the newer AMD APUs from the Ryzen 4000 and the 5000 series are for OEM only. Therefore, they can only be found on pre-built PCs by brands like Dell and HP. At the moment, you can only pick up APUs from the 3000 series off the shelf and build a PC out of them. And the best you can get is the AMD Ryzen 5 3400G with its RX Vega 11 graphics card, which is still far more powerful than the Intel UHD 750 found on even the latest 11th generation Intel processors. Also, it should be pointed out here that unfortunately, due to the shortage of chips all over, the prices for CPUs are sky high. So the actual release price is not the same as the listed price of the CPU. The actual release price or the MSRP of this particular CPU, for instance, is $150. At the time of making this video, the listed price is almost double the release price. So the market situation at the moment isn't too great, but anyhow, I digress. So my point is that if you want the newer APU like the AMD Ryzen 5 4600G or APUs from the 5000 series, for instance, then you will need to buy a pre-built OEM PC by brands like HP or Dell, such as the one that you see here. This particular pre-built PC features the newer AMD APU, the AMD Ryzen 5 4600G. This processor cannot be found as a standalone CPU in the market. In the future, this could change and you may find standalone 4000 or 5000 series APUs, but at the moment you cannot grab them off the shelf. The second segment of the AMD budget market are the normal CPUs, and in contrast to APUs, none of these have an integrated graphics card. So you cannot use the motherboard video ports if you choose to get these instead of the APUs. In other words, you will have to get a dedicated graphics card for connecting a display to your PC. Now the good news, however, is that as far as the sheer single core and multi-core performance goes, the normal CPUs have an edge over the APUs. We explore the performance of the two later. So normal or the mainstream CPUs often have no suffix at all, such as on the Ryzen 3 3100, the X suffix such as on the Ryzen 3 3300X, or the XT suffix such as on the AMD Ryzen 5 3600 XT. Also, the progress of the performance goes from no suffix to X and then to XT. So for instance, AMD Ryzen 5 3600X with no suffix is weaker than the AMD Ryzen 5 3600X, which in turn is weaker than the AMD Ryzen 5 3600 XT. Anyhow, let us now get started with our actual CPU recommendations for the budget AMD segment. First up, we have the AMD Athlon 3000G. The release price of this APU is about $50 in reality, making this one of the cheapest AMD CPUs you can get. But unfortunately, due to the shortage of chips and due to supply and demand issues all across the globe, the listing price of this CPU could be high, depending upon when you look at it. At this moment in time, the price is quite high, but perhaps when you search for it, it could be listed at the actual release price. Anyhow, in this video, we are judging the processors based on the release price or the MSRP. Now, as far as the cheapest AMD CPU goes, this is the model that I recommend. It is an entry-level CPU with 2 cores and 4 threads. It is based on the older Zen architecture, so it isn't nearly as efficient or powerful as the newer processors with Zen 2 or the Zen 3 architecture. But if you want to build a simple system for home or for your office, then this should serve quite well in my opinion. It does have a built-in Vega 3 integrated graphics card as well, and therefore you should be able to use the motherboard video ports with this. Again, this processor will not win any speed records, but for saving up on your very simple AMD build, this is the most economical option I can recommend. And of course, the performance of the CPU is reflected in the benchmark scores, with its Cinebench R20 and Passmark scores being the lowest in this list. Next, we have another APU with a much better CPU and graphics performance compared to the AMD Athlon 3000G mentioned previously. Again, the listing price here is not the actual release price. The actual release price of this APU is $99, not $239. But again, due to the shortage of chips all over, the listing price here is actually quite high at this point in time. Anyhow, this is a quad-core APU with 4 threads and a higher base and boost frequency compared to the Athlon 3000G. As such, it has significantly better benchmark scores too. If you want to build an entry-level desktop with lag-free experience for lighter tasks, then this should serve well. It also has a much more powerful integrated Vega 8 graphics, which actually should be able to support most AAA titles at very low graphics, very low resolution on respectable frame rates. The graphic here shows how the Vega 8 and Ryzen 3 3200G fares against the Intel UHD 610 as found on the Intel Celeron G4 920 and the Intel UHD 630 as found on the Intel Pentium G5600 on different AAA titles. The Vega 8 is easily more than twice as powerful according to these results as tested by PCMag.com. So for entry-level builds and PC with some capacity to game, particularly for lighter games like Minecraft and online games like League of Legends, this is an APU you can look into. Next up, we have a CPU based on the Zen 2 architecture with a much smaller transistor size compared to the APUs we looked at previously. The smaller the transistors, the more efficient the CPU is. And due to the better architecture of this CPU, despite it having a lower clock speed compared to the AMD Ryzen 3 3200G, it actually has a much better performance as can be seen in the benchmark scores. Unfortunately, since it does not have an integrated graphics card, you will need to procure a dedicated GPU in order to connect your monitor. Nevertheless, this is a performance-grade entry-level CPU with excellent single and multi-core scores. If you are planning on building a light gaming or editing desktop, then you can certainly look into this. Another very important point to note is that this processor supports the newer PCI version 4.0 protocol. Hence, I highly recommend that you couple this CPU with either the AMD X570 or the B550 motherboard in order to make use of the newer PCI 4.0 protocol. AMD Ryzen 5 3400G is another APU with one of the most powerful integrated graphics cards in the lower budget range. It is also the most expensive CPU in this rather budget list with a release price of $149. But of course, the listing price at this time is high for reasons mentioned previously in the video. This is a 4-core processor with 8 threads and has a much higher base and boost clock speeds compared to the previously mentioned Ryzen 3 3100. However, since it is based on the older Zen Plus architecture, it doesn't quite perform as well in benchmarks compared to the cheaper Ryzen 3 3100. So if you're looking for sheer CPU performance, I do not recommend Ryzen 5 3400G at its price point, since you can find a much better performance per dollar value in the previously mentioned AMD Ryzen 3 3100. However, if you're looking for a powerful integrated GPU, then perhaps you could find value in this. The following chart shows how the Vega 11 graphics card performs compared to the Vega 8, Intel UHD 610 and the Intel UHD 630 integrated GPUs. You can see that the Vega 11 found on this APU performs quite well in all of the tested games compared to the rest. So in terms of graphics performance, this is clearly the winner. However, you have to gauge for yourself whether to go for this expensive APU or go for a cheaper yet a high performing CPU and couple that with an affordable dedicated graphics card instead. Also, it is worth noting that despite its higher price, it does not offer the newer PCI version 4.0 protocol due to the older Zen Plus architecture. Finally, last but certainly not the least, we have the AMD Ryzen 3 3300X. As far as the sheer performance goes, this one takes the cake. This CPU, in my opinion, is the reigning king in the budget CPU market segment, and as far as the performance goes, this one beats all the CPUs mentioned in this video on various benchmarks. It is based on the Zen 2 architecture and is thus more efficient compared to the AMD Ryzen 5 3400G APU we talked about previously. And it also has support for the newer PCI version 4.0 protocol, so I recommend getting either AMD X570 or B550 motherboard or any other motherboard in the future that supports PCI version 4.0 for the CPU. Also, while it has the best CPU performance, its release price of $120 is actually cheaper than the AMD Ryzen 5 3400G at $150 release price. So whether you want to build a gaming PC or a light PC for content creation, this should squeeze out an excellent performance per dollar value for you. Here is a summary of all the processors reviewed here in this video and their benchmark scores. Here, of course, the Athlon 3000G is the weakest but is also the cheapest CPU in this list with a release price of only $50. On the other hand, AMD Ryzen 3300X is the most powerful CPU, and at $120 release price, it is actually quite fairly priced. However, it does not feature a dedicated graphics card. As far as the AMD APUs are concerned, the Ryzen 5 3400G offers the best graphics with its Vega 11 GPU, but at $150 release price, this isn't quite affordable given its overall CPU performance compared to the Ryzen 3 3100 and the Ryzen 3 3300X. So these were my recommendations for the best budget AMD CPUs. I hope you found the video helpful. If you did, please like the video and press the subscribe button. Also, I'm trying to make this YouTube channel a success, so a like would be highly appreciated.